morning. Thank you, Karina, and I appreciate being asked by you and Liam to speak at this Ethical Corporation Conference. I've been speaking at Ethical Corporation Conferences since 2003, but mostly in London, and welcome to the West Coast. It's a great organization. So, we have an interesting discussion ahead of us for the next nearly hour, and I'm going to make some framing remarks and then turn to Jessica Brown, who's Associate Director of the Climate Policy Initiative, and to Matt Petersen, who's President and CEO of the Los Angeles Cleantech Incubator, to make presentations. And we'll have a brief discussion amongst us, but then move very quickly to you for your questions and comments. And it's our aim to be provocative and challenging. And I think that it's going to be easy to be that in the climate in which we meet. In my view, the world of corporate responsibility and sustainability changed fundamentally, indeed drastically, last November 8th. The result a year ago was a bolt out of the blue for many, although the harbingers were there in the UK with Brexit, the rising tide of populism and nationalism, the sense of economic and social dislocation and alienation among many communities in this country and others in other Western democracies. What's happened, in my view, in the last year is that the U.S. government, whether one agrees with the direction or not, has veered into a fairly radical direction, departing in many areas, not all, from decades of what have been largely, not entirely, bipartisan consensus. And I think that those who support the current administration and president would not just acknowledge, but gleefully ascribe to the notion that there's been a radical disruption of American politics for which they want to continue to take the country in that direction, for better or worse. But the observations I'd like to make now in setting up our discussion are about the role of corporate responsibility relative to government, and specifically to the U.S. government. We've seen, in my view, just a remarkable series of statements and actions from corporate America, particularly but not exclusively from the tech sector this year. We've seen on the immigration issue immediate pushback to the first iteration of the travel ban announced the first week of the administration. We saw on Labor Day week a pushback against the effort to gut the Dreamers Act and begin deporting people, some of whom have been in the United States almost their whole lives. We saw in the wake of the statements made by the current occupant of the Oval Office after the Charlottesville tragedy, extraordinary statements from major CEOs of some of the most important companies in the United States and indeed the world. We saw the dissolution of those advisory councils of the White House after it became clear that major CEOs didn't want to be associated with this White House. And last but not least, we saw an extraordinary corporate response to the decision to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. There was a full-page ad taken out in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the day of the Rose Garden announcement, signed by several dozen of the leading CEOs in corporate America. Some of us wish that those ads had been taken out before the day of the announcement, but then remarkable set of reactions and rebukes to the White House decision within minutes and hours that day early this summer. And we saw just in the last several days, just late last week and over the weekend, a so-called shadow U.S. delegation at the Paris, at the Bonn climate talks, including major business leaders, investors, as well as governors, mayors, environmental NGO activists, and others, all presenting an alternative voice and face to the current U.S. government, albeit without official status at the talks. In my personal view, at the risk of sounding political, these reactions from corporate America have been appropriate and necessary. I don't think it's the responsibility of corporations to form a corporate caucus of the resistance. I think it's the responsibility of corporations, first and foremost, to look after their own interests, but to look after their own interests not just in a U.S. but in a global context, not just in a short term but in a long-term context, not just in terms of their relationships with a Republican White House, but with a Republican Congress and a Democratic Congress, and not just their relationships with elected officials, but with the American public, but also their relationships with various stakeholders, with shareholders, and not least their relationships with their customers, and perhaps even most fundamentally with their own employees, who increasingly want to work for companies with whom they can identify their own values. So I think it's for those reasons, rather than for partisan and political reasons, that so many companies have taken these kinds of steps and actions. In my view, though, as necessary and appropriate as those statements and actions have been, they're not sustainable in and of themselves. The United States government remains the United States government, whether one likes the current president or administration or not. And I believe, and I'm sure most of us do, that for all of the importance of corporate responsibility, for all the creativity and innovation that comes from the private sector, that at the end of the day, governance can't be done without government. And government needs to be inclusive, it needs to be responsive, it needs to aim for consensus, bipartisan consensus to the extent possible in our system. So that, I think, is going to be an extraordinary challenge, not just in the U.S., but in the U.K., elsewhere in Europe, with geopolitical reverberations around the world. So with that very, very broad framing, I want to bring it down to, and to the very important level, not down to, but to the very important level of our two panelists, who are really remarkably suited to address this theme of the relationship between public and private sector actors, the theme of the responsibility of the private sector, the investment world, vis-a-vis government at different levels. And I'm really, really delighted that we've got Jessica Brown, who was at the State Department, part of the climate negotiation team in the Obama administration, who's now the Associate Director of the Climate Policy Initiative and working very closely with corporations, businesses of different sizes and shapes, as well as with investors to address climate risk, climate-related opportunity, mitigation, adaptation, from a sort of hybrid public and private sector perspective. And we've also got Matt Petersen, the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Cleantech Initiative, which also works across the public and private sectors to innovate in this area around climate solutions and clean tech. And what's especially interesting about Matt, in addition to his current role, is his immediate past recent role with the city of Los Angeles as Chief Sustainability Officer of crafting strategies for one of the major metropolitan areas of the whole world, not just the United States. And again, we're seeing, extraordinary focus and commitment now from our cities, mayors, our states, our governors, even if the federal government is moving in a different direction in Washington. So with that, I'd like to turn first to Jessica to offer her perspective, and then Matt, and as I said at the outset, will then mix it up a little bit up here and turn to all of you, and let's all err on the side of being provocative, as I guess I erred in my opening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bennett. So as Bennett mentioned, my name's Jessica Brown. I'm Associate Director with Climate Policy Initiative. We're an organization comprised of analysts and advisors working to address climate change while also supporting economic growth and development. And we have a particular focus on finance and policy and also the intersection between finance and policy. We tend to focus mainly on emerging markets and developing countries because we kind of have a hybrid approach of caring about the environment and caring about poverty and development issues as well. So that's going to be largely the perspective I take as I talk to you through my speech. I also wanted to mention that I'm going to talk more about the investment landscape as opposed to the sort of corporate company level landscape, but obviously those two are very much interrelated. So to start with, I wanted to tell you a little bit about some recent work that we published. We have an annual report called the Global Landscape of Climate Finance, which basically provides a snapshot of total global investment in low carbon and climate resilient activities. CPI's global landscape is often viewed as the most accurate and comprehensive snapshot of investment. And I wasn't able, Karina told me not to use slides, but I will try and demonstrate with my hands the size of different amounts of investment. It seems to work well with my 3-year-old, so hopefully it can translate here as well. So what our global landscape shows, which again just came out a couple weeks ago, we've tracked the last 2 years of investment. For 2015, global investment was roughly $437 billion, so this big. 2016 shrank slightly to 387, so this big. In terms of investment needs, probably don't have arms quite big enough, but you know, the estimates vary widely about what's needed. A lot of people coalesce around this idea of $1 trillion per annum needed for additional investment to support low carbon and climate resilient activities. So, you know, in terms of the trends we've seen over the years, we've been tracking this for the past 5 years. We've seen continued growth. Obviously, there was a slight dip in the last year. That's largely related to falling technology costs, which is only a positive thing. There were some drops in numbers also related to lower capacity additions in some countries like China. They saw sort of a phasing out of a revenue support policy for wind. So that was one sort of downside of investment in the last year. But overall, it's been a steady increase. And if you know, taking into account annual fluctuations, the last 2 years saw an overall increase of about 12% compared to the previous 2 years. So overall, a very positive story, especially on private investment. We've seen a huge amount of growth in investment for onshore wind as well as solar. In terms of the IEA's projections about what's needed to avoid dangerous climate change, we're actually on track with what they're projecting for both onshore wind and solar. However, basically every other renewable energy technology, offshore wind, geothermal, hydro, we're very much off track. So we do need to have a lot more investment supporting those technologies at the global scale. It's also interesting to look at the amount of public investment going into these different areas. And actually, for the first time ever, what we saw this year is there's more public investment happening now in energy efficiency than in renewable energy. And that's quite remarkable. I think it tells us two things. One is that the world is finally waking up to the need to invest in energy efficiency. And the second is that probably what this is demonstrating is that the renewable energy markets are maturing so that private investment can take over where public investment is leaving off. So to me, that's a very positive sign. There's a lot of positive elements. I think another important kind of counterpoint to all of this is how does low carbon climate investment compare in size and scale to fossil investment? And, you know, analogy I often use is when you're on a diet, you can't just count the salads you're eating. You have to think about how much ice cream you're eating as well. So really looking at both sides of the ledger is critical. So just some points of context there. If you look at just power generation alone, the point at which energy is being generated, and you compare fossil fuel investment in the past couple of years with renewable energy investment, actually, renewable energy investment has doubled that of fossil investment in the past 2 years. However, if you take the broader kind of upstream and downstream investments, the mining, the exploration, the pipelines, et cetera, then it really starts to dwarf how much investment is happening in renewable energy. So that total landscape of fossil investment, the upstream, the downstream, and the electricity generation is something on the order of $825 billion. So that very much starts to dwarf the numbers that we're seeing, for example, the $387 billion in low carbon investments. So that's just sort of a scene setter to give you an idea of what kind of investment landscape we're operating in. Something that we're really focused on at CPI is trying to build innovation into the system. I'm sure this is something very close and dear to the hearts of these two as well. We run something called the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which helps identify, develop, and ultimately pilot new ideas for climate finance instruments as well as business models to support mitigation and adaptation activities in developing countries, really with the aim of driving private investment into these activities. And we do this through a crowdsourcing approach, so we gather ideas from folks all over the world. We then screen those ideas against predetermined criteria that we use, and then we work with our high-level members of our lab, which are folks from government, private institutions, pension funds, development finance institutions, et cetera, to choose the 2 to 3 ideas that we think are the most promising, and then we work to vet and stress test and analyze them further and get them ripe for, ultimately for piloting. And we have the Global Innovation Lab. We also have one focused specifically on innovative ideas for Brazil, as well as one for India. And we also have something called the FIRE Awards for Sustainable Finance, which actually we've worked with Proterra closely in the FIRE Awards. And through this process, we've actually endorsed over 25 different financial instruments and have been able to mobilize $1 billion of investment. So overall, it's a really positive story. It's a really interesting focus on innovation, and it seems that investors are quite attracted to trying to pilot new ideas. The other thing I wanted to mention is just thinking about, what policymakers can do to start encouraging more investment into emerging markets and developing countries in order to support the kind of corporate sustainability activities that you all are doing. So one interesting fact that we find is that investment tends to end up in the same country in which it originates, meaning there's a real sort of domestic bias, a domestic preference for investors. That's not surprising, but what it does mean is that we need to start to encourage policymakers to address those real and perceived risks and barriers that investors are facing when thinking about investing overseas. So this means thinking about things like how to control for currency risk, how to support the pipeline of new and profitable business models and ideas within those countries, how to get the sort of baseline enabling framework right for investment, the legal systems, the governance systems that are needed to support that investment overall. So with that, I think I'll stop and hand it over to you, Matt.
Thank you.
This work? No. Borrow your mic. Is it working? Oh, it is working. Light's just not on. Oh, thank you. It's great to be here. I am coming in a different context just 3 months ago. As Bennett mentioned, I left the mayor's office of Los Angeles to become the CEO of what we affectionately call LACI, the Los Angeles Cleantech Incubator. And we're going about, as any new CEO of any enterprise comes in, looking at how we reframe what we do, and probably going to be really rolling out our work regionally. And then we have some presence. We have 4 startups that we incubate that are here in the Bay Area. Really looking at how we expand how we're seen and the tools we use beyond incubation, which is core to what we're doing, and creating an inclusive green economy. But then how do we use the tools of market transformation, which my 19 years running Global Green USA and 4 years in the mayor's office, I know well. You need a mix between setting the market signals through policymakers and legislatures and mayors, but you also need to figure out how do you get the market there. You need to get the key stakeholders and really driving those social and economic and equity benefits along the way. And so we're focused on 3 priority areas at my organization. That's energy, of course, smart cities, and transportation. If you looked at our website now, you'd probably still see about 6 different mission statements. And so as part of my task as the new CEO to bring a little focus to the organization. But we'll be doing a lot within transportation. LA just passed a $120 billion ballot measure a year ago to fund public transit in the county of Los Angeles, led by Mayor Garcetti, both as chair of Metro and the chief proponent of that ballot measure. That's going to be game-changing. We also know that LA is sort of seen as the car capital of the world, for better or for worse. How do we take that to our advantage? And we also have a little event going to happen in 2028 called the Olympics in Los Angeles. So how do we really accelerate the goals that people like Mary Nichols and the California Air Resources Board have set, that the governor has set, that the mayor has set around zero emissions goods movement? We have 2 ports in Los Angeles, which 40% of all the goods that come into the United States come through those 2 ports. They just passed a couple weeks ago a Clean Air Action Plan that sets the zero emission goal of 2035 zero emission trucks and 2030 zero emission cargo handling equipment. Goals I helped the mayor put forth back in June, and now they've put out the plan of saying how they're going to get there. Things like the market forces at play, of course. Elon Musk's new truck, which will be unveiled Thursday night, will be critical to that. As every conversation about transportation, he and Tesla are often mentioned, as Matt mentioned earlier. But it's also companies like BYD and the other traditional OEMs that are going to be part of that transformation, as we've seen in the bus market too. So that's who we are and what we're doing. We have 44 companies now in our portfolio. We $135 million invested in our company, in our companies. We've created about 1,500 jobs out of our portfolio. And really, if you haven't been to our campus in the Arts District in downtown LA, it's worth a visit. It's 61,000 square feet of adult playground. It's not only really amazing co-working space. You know, we're not Facebook, but the Senate President Pro Tem Kevin DeLeon walked through. He hadn't been through, even though it's in his district. My first week on the job, and he said, "Wow, I feel like I'm up at Facebook in Silicon Valley." I mean, it's a unique space for the audience and the constituency we serve. And what's also remarkable is it's built by utility. The Department of Water and Power, under the previous mayor's leadership and the current mayor's leadership, really was supported through their economic development function, which a municipal utility can uniquely focus on, put the money in to build the campus. And we have a $10 million prototyping center that some of our startups have gone from soup to nuts, literally, in prototyping their product and assembling their product in the center. So please come and visit. But, you know, one thing I wanted to mention that Susan commented on earlier in the first panel, I'm actually looking at how do we take an equity stake. So if you come to us and we invite you into the portfolio, our initial offering is 5% equity. We don't put any money in, but we give you the coaching, we give you the access to the facilities, investor introductions, pitch prep, all that stuff that you would expect. But how do we reward the companies as they go along the development, the spectrum of their company, get access to markets and grow their company? How do we reward them for having more women in the C-suite? How do we reward them for having a more diverse workforce? How do we reward them for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in their operations? And having proof points, not just self-reporting metrics, but which we do. We just released our first impact report that we're going to work with other incubators across the country to try to make a standard for Cleantech incubators to use as a set of metrics. So we had our first company just came in that we actually tested this model, and we're going to continue to roll that out. We had a company come in, and they said, "Hey, we're based in the Bay Area, but we want to hire 10 people from CalWorks program to be working in your annex across the street, assembling our product." This company's called Bears for Humanity. And they use organic materials, and they use CalWorks employees as their employee base, people coming off the welfare rolls. And so if they keep those 10 employees employed at our facility in LA, we're going to give them 1 point back on their equity stake. So we're trying to walk our talk and really reward people doing what we want to create an economy. Pivoting to my previous role, because I think that's important, given Bennett's setup here. We created something when I was working for Mayor Garcetti that we then called the Mayor's National Climate Action Agenda. Really horrible, long name. The acronym was MNCAA, and everybody stumbled on it. And then before I left the mayor's office, I promised him that I would change the name, and we call it Climate Mayors now. A lot easier to say. But we started with 3 mayors: the mayor of Houston, a woman named Anise Parker, the first openly gay mayor in Texas, and Mayor Nutter of Philadelphia, and Mayor Garcetti. We launched it, the Clinton Global Initiative, in a little different context in 2014. We really started it because a guy named Rohan Patel and others at the White House needed some wind at the back of the President of the United States going into Paris in 2015, and we also knew there was value in peer-to-peer networks between mayors and staff to work together on climate change. And so we grew from 3 mayors to 33 by the time of the U.S.-China Climate Summit that we hosted between U.S. mayors and Chinese mayors in Los Angeles in October 2015. Really a seminal moment that put wind at the back of your former colleagues, Jessica, because it showed the Chinese that President Obama wasn't just throwing a number out there, that there were cities and states willing to back it up with action. And then fast forward a year, I was teaching a class at UCLA when we all remember where we were when the election results came in, and everything changed. And we went from being a group of mayors working together to do good things to really trying to be a voice of if not opposition, contrast, certainly, for how cities are going to lead the way. We put out an open letter then inviting President-elect Trump to work with cities. 77 mayors signed on. We went from 33 to 77. Fast forward, anticipating him pulling out of the Paris Agreement, we asked every mayor to sign on to say they would adopt the Paris Climate Agreement by taking additional actions that they hadn't already imagined, whether it's buying electric buses, electric vehicles in their fleet, energy efficiency, renewable energy, solar, whatever they felt they needed to do to take action. And we went, on the morning of that Rose Garden announcement, we went from 50 mayors that had signed on by the time we got there to 150 that afternoon, and now we're 383 climate mayors that are part of that effort. And I'm proud to continue to play a small role. I'm board chair of Climate Mayors and continue to advise the mayor and his staff on how to continue to build on this momentum of mayors and cities. We know it's there, and of course right now in Bonn, Governor Brown, along with former Mayor Bloomberg, have been talking about leadership of cities and states and business as well. And in that process, as we were putting together Climate Mayors, and in the ramp up, we also, of course, worked with the We're Still In coalition and joined with them in terms of the businesses that signed on to say they're going to stay in the climate agreement, and all the other actors and parties of universities and others that really rolled up. And now we're really seeing the beginning of that execution of that vision. And you know, what's unique about this Climate Mayors thing, and I'll just add sort of a final comment, is originally it was just those really impressive mid-sized cities like a Santa Monica or a Knoxville, Tennessee, that had long had a commitment, and then of course the big cities. Now there's 83 cities, including San Antonio, which the new mayor, when he came in, promised he would sign on, but also small cities, 20 to 40,000 people. They don't have staff to drive what they're doing. It's really, so their actions are going to be a lot simpler, but still meaningful. And begin to add up and make a dent in the efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and stay on track for the Paris Agreement.
Great, thank you. So thanks to Jessica and Matt. And I'm going to ask you both one big question to really try to tackle head on, and then open up to all of you, not just for questions, but comments, please, directed at any or all of us. So, of course, there is huge symbolic importance around the fact that the United States government is now the only government in the world following the decisions by Nicaragua and Syria, of all governments in the last couple of weeks, to finally join the Paris Accord. huge symbolic importance that the United States is no longer going to be withdrawing. But what's the substantive importance? If you think fast forward 3 years to the fourth quarter of 2020, what will patterns of investment in clean tech and climate mitigation and adaptation look like in the U.S.? Will we meet our initial Paris commitments? What can be done to compensate for the cuts of the budget, for example, that in the funding for developing countries' efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate, which were, of course, a key part of the agreement itself. And thinking about the so-called shadow delegation in Bonn of the last week, cumulatively, how does it all add up? States, cities, corporations of all sizes and shapes, industries and investors. So ultimately, how much does it matter substantively as well as symbolically? And both of you have, just really significant perspectives on that question. So over to you to try to tackle that one for what it's worth, and then over to all of you.
Yeah, so when I was in the mayor's office, we were working closely with Michael Bloomberg's philanthropic staff, of course, which he has since announced America's Pledge, which is really going to be the effort to quantify the ability of the cities and states and business actions and how we measure up to meeting our commitment of 2 degrees Celsius, let alone the goal of 1.5. And WRI and Rocky Mountain Institute are going to lead that work. So we'll see. I think we can make a lot of progress towards the overall U.S. commitment, but not having anything going on, if actually worse, rolling back of efforts at the federal level is going to make it a lot harder, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. And I think the leadership of cities and states and businesses is really going to be critical. In that process, I think in a little less than a year from now, Governor Brown will host his summit, which will be a major gathering and sort of the next milestone, I think, globally. It won't just be a U.S. or certainly not just a California context. It's a global context, and gathering, and world leaders will be here. I mean, I was with Governor Brown in June representing the mayor in Beijing when he was accepted as really a head of state by President Xi in representing the voice of U.S. leadership on climate change, and it was a remarkable moment. Certainly he didn't get the red carpet rollout that our current president loves so much in the most recent visit, but it was really remarkable. And at the same time, the Secretary of Energy was walking around talking to people, and it was just such a contrast. But in terms of the investment, I think Governor Cuomo is in Los Angeles today. What New York is doing is going to do matters. It's not just California. I mean, California sort of dwarfs a lot of other places, is really the 6th largest economy in the world. And what the legislature and the governor have done, what Mary and CARB have done, what Michael and PUC have done, and what Bob and CEC have done, with a lot of direction, of course, from the policymakers, is significant. We are going to transform how we move people around through electrified propulsion, and how we, of course, make sure an autonomous future is a shared and electric future in that process. So there's a lot that's happening. And in terms of the investment side, clean tech as we knew it from the Solinga days, of course, is dead. But clean tech and smart investing and some great investment firms like Obvious Ventures is out there, and many others that are really beginning to deploy capital into the investments we're going to need to really address these market signals and hopefully go beyond.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jessica.
I think it's a great question. I don't want us to downplay how important it is symbolically to pull out of Paris, and to be the only country that has done so or hasn't signed on is quite staggering. In terms of the substance, how it affects us, I mean, kind of a rallying cry that a lot of my colleagues and I have is thank God for market forces, because in the US, you know, we're already seeing a dent in our overall emissions growth and curve because we've moved from coal to gas, and that's purely from market forces perspective. It's nothing that the federal government, whether it's under the Obama administration or Trump, has anything to do with. That said, the rolling back of very significant policies and regulations like the Clean Power Plan are going to have big impact, and we're going to see that probably 5-10 years from now in terms of our emissions. So, you know, we will feel those effects. I mean, it's hard to say what the counterfactual would have been under a Clinton administration. Nobody really knows, but we can all say for sure that it would, you know, it would have been better in terms of emissions. And, you know, that alone was still not enough. I mean, if you think about the countries that have signed on to Paris, we all know that we're nowhere close to meeting the 2 degrees target. So what we were hoping, if we did continue to see progress with, you know, an administration that does believe in climate change, is that we would begin to see policies take effect and have the experience of that in order to ratchet them up over time in order to get to where we need to be. But we're not seeing that. So it's a significant lost opportunity in terms of being able to learn in terms of how we can improve and progress and ratchet up ambition over time. And the other point that you mentioned, Bennett, is, I mean, President Trump has pulled back completely our support from the Green Climate Fund, which is a major multilateral climate fund supporting activities for supporting mitigation and adaptation activities in developing countries. He's basically stripped out in the president's budget basically all foreign aid going to support climate activities. So our role, we were previously really leaders, the cutting edge of supporting investment overseas, and that's completely gone. So that's going to have a very material impact as well.
Thank you for your, both of you, for your answers. So, over to you. We've got 15 or 20 minutes for questions and comments. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Barry, representing a small organization called Ring Barrel Consultants. I have a philosophical question with what we just discussed. Do we really think that denial of climate and denial of sustainability is a sustainable position in the future? In other words, are the forces of nature, the forces of activities of other countries, the momentum going to overwhelm whatever federal policy exists, or could this be maintained for a generation?
Wow. Over to you guys.
Yeah, you know, the first thing comes to mind is denial is not just a river in Egypt, but it's you know, the optimist in me says yes, the forces, whether it's what the policy leadership in places like California and the market forces where businesses are standing up, whether it's on social issues or environmental issues or sexual harassment issues or whatever it is, and in the face of whatever the norm used to be or the denial is at the moment. It's kind of hard to fathom, though, with what is being said and done in Washington right now in the White House, particularly that that you know, we're going to overcome that. But I think the tides will turn, the pendulum will swing, and we'll have to make up ground pretty quickly, both in parallel while they're taking these actions and thwarting them wherever we can through leadership, and then pick up the pace in 3.5 years.
Very good, Jessica.
Yeah, I don't really have too much to add, but I think the answer depends on how many dystopian novels that you read. And luckily, I haven't read many lately, so I mean, I don't think this is a sustainable situation at all. But you know, I also live in Berkeley. I live in a bubble, so. Exactly.
Yeah. Go Bears. Very good. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, Bill Weil from Facebook. So thank you both for what you've been saying and for your leadership, and Bennett, you as well.
Thank you.
I think, so I'm a pessimist at heart, honestly. I mean, that just, my I sort of, the glass is, well, mostly empty. Except a physicist says it's full because it's not a vacuum, but you know, that's a whole other thing. But I think that what keeps me going in the face of last fall's election and what Trump has been doing, you know, this panel's about business leadership. And I think that to your point about, well, we can wait 3.5 years, I think that in fact waiting is the worst thing we can do. And some of the things you mentioned actually are about companies and others who aren't waiting. And I just got back from Bonn, so I'm even more jet lagged than Susan, I think. The U.S. Climate Action Pavilion was the biggest U.S. pavilion ever at any COP. It was really impressive. It was carrying the message that the U.S., not the people in the White House and sort of in that whatever 2-mile radius around Congress and the White House, is in and is committed to working on this. And I think the real question to me is, okay, so 2,500 businesses, mayors, governors, investors, college presidents have signed up for We Are Still In. What are they going to do? And what are all the people and the organizations represented in this room going to do? And I think that, to me, is the real challenge and actually an opportunity, because the Trump administration's positions have made it clear that we can't just wait for the federal government to do things. We've got to move like hell.
Yeah.
So I would suggest, I just want to throw out a couple things. I'd love your guys' thoughts on what could we all be doing. But one is, whatever organization you're part of, you use energy, you should be moving aggressively toward 100% renewables as fast as you can. And there are a lot of companies that are actually doing that today. And the other is, if you have any vehicles, you should be moving as aggressively as you can to 100% EVs to help support the growth of the EV market. Those are things that every organization could be doing today. Yeah. And will move things much faster than probably the Hillary Clinton policies would have. Yeah. If we get, instead of making it what a few leading companies are doing, let's make it business as usual in the next 3 years, so that by the time we get to the 2020 election, the world's different.
Oh, wonderful. Let me just, that's great. Let me just react quickly to Bill and then turn to Jessica and Matt to see if you have any comments. I just want to be explicit about what I more or less said implicitly in my opening half an hour ago, which is I really believe that business leadership now has to go beyond the corporate responsibility and sustainability paradigm of the last 2 decades, which has been absolutely necessary, but in my view, no longer sufficient. And business leadership now has to be more directly than ever in the policy arena, and even indeed in the political arena, given the events of the last year, the examples that we've cited up here. And I want to be very careful, not the partisan political arena, but it's very difficult to separate politics from policy. It's increasingly impossible. But my own view is that what we're seeing now in climate, from the corporate world with some exceptions, the investment world with some exceptions, but the private sector generally, overall, is remarkably timely, significant leadership that is motivated in large part in direct reaction to what we've been seeing from this administration. And it's my guess and hope, frankly, that we're going to continue to see this kind of leadership for the duration of this administration, but beyond, to make up for the U.S. government. And the U.S. government will change at some point. We'll see if that's sooner rather than later. But I think that we have a new definition now that corporate leaders have been showing us of what business leadership can and should look like in this era. Okay.
Hallelujah. My name is Bruce Hagan, Bay Area resident. I'm with a group called Citizens Climate Lobby. We have a project called Business Climate Leaders. We're all about not waiting for the next Congress. And in particular, that statement about thank God for market forces. Businesses don't just respond to market forces, they create market forces. And one of the things we have to do is put a price on carbon. In the United States, the world will follow. That's what our organization is trying to do, and we're trying to get businesses to step up, step beyond the very important footprint and sustainability activities and step out into the policy arena in any way that suits them. We can move this Congress. We've got 30 members of the Republican Party on the House Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. By working with those members district by district on a nonpartisan, respectful way, and there's a way to do this, but we're here to implore all these businesses to check this out as a viable way to move the market.
Wonderful.
And if you have a comment on that, or you want to talk further about what role God might have in this, I'd be interested in asking her to give us some help.
Wonderful. Jessica or Matt?
I agree in the price and carbon. I mean, we just renewed cap and trade here in California of critical importance, you know, and as Governor Brown and Michael Bloomberg wrote in their New York Times op-ed this morning, I think it was, they talked about how states can opt into RGGI in the Northeast and other, you know, and that was part of our philosophy. Well, it's not the business focus, is how to prepare cities for an eventual state-by-state or federal solution for the reality of climate action. But, you know, shout out to Bill for his leadership at Facebook and before that at Google and everybody else in the room that's really helping their corporation to move the needle and walk the talk.
By the way, we're going to be hearing from Bill this afternoon to talk more about what Facebook's been up to. Jessica, any quick comment from you?
No, just to say that I do think that having corporations apply an internal price of carbon is a really important step, even if there's not sort of an outside policy mandate for that. I think that can be really useful in terms of how you're spending your own resources. I was also just going to add to the list of things that you can do to Bill's list. One important one from my perspective is philanthropy for climate. I think, you know, speaking with some friends that work at foundations, the latest assessment is that global philanthropy going to climate is only 1% of total philanthropy. So increasing overall spending for climate from that perspective is really important too.
Yes, ma'am.
So I would like to respond to what Bill has said. I think it is a really interesting idea to think that perhaps because of the administration we're responsible for, and maybe end up in a better place than if we had the administration. Not that I in any way would advocate either. But do you think, you know, that at the end of the day, we might end up in this better place if we have mayors and we're thinking, you know, what can we do at this local level on the city, but also what can firms do and what can they do faster if they want to be, you know, competing not just in the U.S. but in a global market where other people take it really seriously.
Well, the examples Bill gave for corporations are the same things that are probably the top of the list for every city, whatever their size. You know, even if you have 5 cars in your city fleet, moving to all electric vehicles is a great move. It's both a proof point and it's an example that you can show your citizens. And then, you know, one of the things we did in the city of LA is when we put together this very comprehensive sustainable city plan. And we capitalize L and A in plan and lowercase p just to emphasize Los Angeles. But we set goals around procurement of electric vehicles. And when we rolled it out, I had to define to all the fleet managers and procurement officers in the room. They said, oh, well, we can get some Chevy Volts. I'm like, no, it's fully electric vehicles we're talking about here. We've got to really figure out how we prepare for an electrified fleet, not just for the city, but for our residents. And then, you know, the people that stood up first were the police department. They now have 200 pure battery electric vehicles in the city of LA's police force. It's not for pursuit vehicles, but I also asked Elon if he would loan us one, and he did. And it's now dressed up like a cop car and being tested as a potential pursuit vehicle for the future.
Cool. Okay, we got about 5 more minutes. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Mary McDonald with Earthshare. I wanted to come at it from another perspective, and that's from corporate internal stakeholders, your employees. There was a survey of corporate 1,000 employees done by a company called Pavato back in the spring that tested the atmosphere, not just social issues, but a lot of environmental and climate change issues as well of employees. And it was astronomically exciting to me to see how the response came back from across the country from employees on these issues, whether they were blue state or red states. So I know it's not surprising to us that our East Coasters or West Coasters, but this was across the board. And I think, you know, working internally with your employees as well to take that to the next level and you use them as your corporate ambassadors to really get that out. I mean, we know that the consumer, that drives their purchasing powers in a lot of ways, but let's look at the internal workings as well.
So I'll reply on quickly, having spent a lot of my career in corporate America, to say that I think you raise a critically important point, and it's been widely reported this year that much of the impetus behind the statements from CEOs, particularly on Paris, but really at least as much in reaction to Charlottesville and immigration issues, has been the impetus from employees. The CEO of Microsoft has been very explicit on exactly this ground, that there's a high degree of alignment between values that employees hold that they want to see aligned with their company and vice versa. I think this is particularly a phenomenon in the tech industry, but as you say, way beyond the tech industry, way beyond the Bay Area, and even if more centered on the two coasts, it's a wider spread phenomenon between the coasts as well. I see this in my own work, which focuses more on human rights and labor rights internationally, even than environmental sustainability, where there is a tremendous degree of commitment that's become apparent in industry after industry, again, not just tech, of employees wanting to see a direct connection with values with their employers. And I think companies are recognizing this in their recruiting practices, but really to their corporate policies and what we're hearing now from CEOs. It's an extraordinarily important point, and I don't think it's one that any of us would have made a decade or two ago. Any comments from? Thank you for that one. Others, yes, sir.
Yes, again, Graham Richard, the former mayor of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Matt, thank you for the leadership that you and Mayor Garcetti, it sort of reminds me of a gathering that we had in 2005 before the Kyoto Protocol issues arose, where we got together mayors. And so almost 10 years after 1,000 mayors in 2007, we're now back at the same challenge. Here's the observation, and Bill, I appreciate your comments, and I'm with the Advanced Energy Economy. We have about 1,000 companies that we represent to promote secure, clean, affordable energy policy at the state and the federal level. Here's the challenge, that I would like to be an optimist. But when we see in this current tax plan the abolition of all incentives for electrification of vehicles, when we see a dismissive approach by the legislators in the tax plan right now in the Congress that will kill off 50,000 wind jobs in the United States today by abrogating the bipartisan agreement on the PTC, when we see in the Geneva trade case the potential for the cost of solar in this country if President Trump, with the stroke of his pen, decides to put up very substantial barriers, the costs of solar will go up. Now, we don't know what he'll do in these cases, but it's not just a Paris issue. It's really an immediate public policy issue in state after state. And those of us, I moved from Fort Wayne to California here to work on this initiative, but my legislators were Dan Quayle, Dan Coates, Mark Souder, Mike Pence. 74% coal on the grid in the home state of Indiana. The carbon interests are alive and well in most of the states in this country. So I don't want to take lightly this challenge. I do believe the business voice. So I charge all of us in the room to talk about what can we do? What will make a difference? Buying electric vehicles. I love riding over in my electric bicycle. Buying electric vehicles, decarbonization of the grid, electrifying everything, radical improvement of building energy efficiency. We know the solutions, but the public policy in many cases is going the wrong direction.
Right. Very good. Thank you. Really good. Thank you. We've got just a couple more minutes. Yes, ma'am, please.
Well, the Mayor Garcetti declared on Twitter a couple weeks ago, this is the favored format for such things these days, that he's not going to run for governor, which changed the dynamics a little bit of the gubernatorial race here in California. He did create something called the America's Accelerator, which he's working with Mayor Buttigieg of, forgetting the city in Indiana, and South Bend, and Buttigieg. And I always say his name wrong. and a couple other mayors, and really trying to see how they help local transportation efforts. And all that's a way of me saying he's continuing to explore the idea. I'm here to serve.
Very good. Okay, any last question or comment? Let's just take two. The lady here and then the gentleman in the front.
Thanks. Monica Wynn is my name. I'm a faculty member at the University of Victoria, and I just wanted to say thanks, first of all, for everybody being here and trying to push things forward. So, two comments, and going from the global to the personal. When we talk about mitigation and adaptation, a lot of times we really don't think about what it means. Mitigation means we are making things less bad than they would be otherwise. Okay, this is as I'm talking to my students, but it brings it down to what we're actually trying to do. The adaptation piece is the piece that really requires a huge amount of resilience, not only in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of how we organize ourselves, markets, et cetera, but also at the personal level.
Right.
So the aspect I just wanted to toss out into the room is our own emotions and managing the aspect of hope is absolutely critical to keep our own energy going on doing the important things that are needed. So I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for pushing forward.
And I want to say thanks to you coming from Victoria. The cover of this current issue of the Ethical Corporation magazine, the anti-Trump, can Trudeau turn Canada from climate villain to hero. So thank you for, you know,
As the article says, we hope he's not just a pretty face.
we hope, indeed. Thank you for that. Yes, sir, and then we'll wrap up with you.
I have a question which hasn't been addressed. In Europe, the number of vacancies is going through the roof. And for me, the question is, we are moving into a transition. And if you look to the numbers that Tesla is putting on the market, they are running behind in the numbers of products they can bring onto the market, actually. So they are not meeting the demand. Everybody wants to have the car tomorrow. What are you going to do? Or that's also a question to the public. How do we facilitate that, first of all, people are getting the knowledge and making that transition also in their mind that they need to go for a new job and support companies in that direction? Because I think that is maybe the hampering of making that transition possible within the next few years.
Well, in terms of the supply not meeting the demand, I think General Motors' announcement recently that they're going to go all electric is, I mean, again, as said earlier by Matt, you know, Elon and Tesla have changed the game, but they're not the only player in town, and that object of aspiration it was critical and something I worked on when we put celebrities into hybrid cars to go to the Oscars, and the only car company that would loan us cars at the time was Toyota, and then the Prius got all the love from that press attention. But I think the point being that the market will respond to the demand. You're going to see the OEM step up, both from a Chinese pull. I mean, that's really, who would have thought that Chinese would be the climate heroes right now in the world? But they are, in relative terms. I mean, clearly there's a long way to go in China, but the move on vehicles alone is really the big market for us.
Good. Jessica? Okay. I think that we're at time, so I want to thank Jessica and Matt, and thank all of you for your really terrific questions and comments. And over to Karina to take us to the next session or lunch, I'm not sure which. Next session. Very good, thank you.